Hi, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is David Zyla. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club hosts over 150 free programs, all open to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Following today's conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the chat or Q&A function to type in any of your questions. So, without further ado, I am very excited to share with you that today we are joined by Elana Levine. Levine, and let me tell you a little bit about her. Elana is a professor of media, cinema, and digital studies in the Department of English at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She is the author of Her Stories, Daytime Soap Opera and U.S. Television History, as well as Wallowing in Sex, the New Sexual Culture of 1970s American Television, co-author of Legitimating Television, Media Convergence and Cultural Status, and the editor of Cupcakes, Pinterest, and Lady Porn, Feminized Popular Culture in the Early 21st Century. Elana, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. It's a thrill to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this television festival. I'm thrilled that you're doing this programming and I get to be a part of it. So as David was suggesting, my talk today is coming out of my most recent book, which was just published in 2020, and it's called Her Stories, Daytime Soap Opera and U.S. Television History. I'm going to switch over to some slides. I'm going to move back and forth from some slides and putting me back full screen throughout the talk. So this book project was a way of bringing together really two of my main interests as a researcher, which are American television history and women's media culture, forms of media that are associated with women. Now, today I want to share some insights from the book and my research in general. I'm going to focus primarily on the period from the 1950s into the 1980s. And this is a significant period for the histories of both American television and soap opera as part of it, as I'll get to in a minute, and also significant in terms of women's roles in women's lives, because women's lives go through a lot of changes in that time period, in the post-World War II era, through the women's liberation movement and what happens after that. Now, let me just clarify before we jump into this today, what I mean when I talk about daytime soap opera and what my book means by that. These are programs that began in radio in the 1930s and then transitioned to television in the 1950s. There's fewer of them on the air today than in the past, but there are still these programs that air every weekday for 30 minutes or 1 hour a day, year-round, new episodes. They tell continuing stories, mostly focused on interpersonal relationships, families, romantic relationships, that sort of thing, and tend to have very long, convoluted plots. Some of the stories might stretch credulity. They sometimes can be a little outlandish, but viewers tend to be really more invested in the characters and in their emotional experiences and can kind of go with the flow with the plot regardless. People are willing to accept lots of unrealistic stuff to watch characters they care about and what they're going through. So for me, this is a really important topic. And I'm just going to switch back here for a few minutes to talk to you, because this is a form of television that's always been part of the medium, but is rarely taken seriously or looked at closely. And in part, that's because of its associations with women. Scholars before me have talked about soap opera as a space where women's interests and women's concerns do get voiced. And my research is looking at that as well, but I'm also looking at kind of how these programs and the audience's involvement with them have changed over time, and how changes in television and changes in American women's history kind of can be understood through thinking about this history of the daytime soap opera. So there's so many fascinating parts of this history. It's almost hard to know what to tell you about in such a short time. But I have a that I'm going to try to highlight for you today. I'd like to start with that post-World War II era. And this is an important period because this is the period when these programs transition from being radio programs to being television programs. And their goal, of course, was to bring women audiences to this new medium of TV. Now, you need to understand some things about soap operas in the radio era due to their continuing narrative applied to them, because the people who owned the programs and sponsored them were domestic goods companies like Procter & Gamble or Colgate-Palmolive, companies that produced these programs as a way to advertise their products like laundry soap, dish soap, that sort of thing. Now, the opera part was meant to be a kind of disparaging contrast to those kind of mundane household products that the programs were advertising. And in this respect, these programs had a pretty bad reputation amongst cultural elites. They were kind of seen as sort of melodramatic and silly. And a lot of the disparagement of these programs for decades was kind of rooted in some of these assumptions about them from the radio days. Now, in the late 1940s, it was clear that television was the new frontier, and it was really emerging as the new medium. But it was uncertain whether daytime television made sense as a commercial enterprise and as a way to entertain people and advertise these products. And this is because housewives were seen as the primary audience for these programs, and housewives were assumed to be interested in daytime radio because they could go about their household tasks as they were listening. The assumption was that they wouldn't stop their housework to just watch TV during the day, and that was why radio worked so well. The assumption at the time also, I think, is a little different today, is that we would have to really focus on TV and pay attention to it to watch it. So screens were much smaller in those days. Now, eventually, some of the people who were involved in the world of the radio serials decided to try out TV. And their challenge was really to figure out how to tell stories in a medium that had visuals as well as sound. They knew that sound was going to be really important because they knew that some of those women who were doing housework might walk away from the set to take care of a pot on the stove or something like that. But they also knew that they had to use the visuals of the new medium. So this was a real challenge for the people who wanted to make these programs. And it was a challenge that was faced in part by the women creators of many of these programs. And they really took on this task of trying to figure out how to appeal to those audiences. In doing that, they put women characters in very central roles in these programs. And this was a carryover from radio, and television versions were going to be the same. Now, I'd like to show you a key person involved in this creation of these programs from radio to TV. And that's a woman named Erna Phillips. Erna Phillips pretty much invented this storytelling form in radio. She was a writer, and she created a number of different radio serials. She wrote one of the first attempts at a TV soap opera, a program called These Are My Children. It aired for a very short time in 1949, and NBC, the network that aired it, was still not convinced that TV was the place for this form. They were still kind of holding on to those radio programs. They didn't support the show. It ended quickly. But Phillips was, quite a visionary. He realized that there was room for this kind of programming in television. What she did is she convinced her employers, who were the domestic goods manufacturers, Procter & Gamble. She convinced them to make a TV version of her hit radio serial, The Guiding Light. And this is just a news story from that period. Phillips was a really savvy business person, as well as a very creative writer. And she knew TV was the future, and she wanted her programs to be part of it. She had to convince Procter & Gamble, however, that it could work and that women would turn in. And Procter & Gamble was well known to be a pretty conservative company, not willing to take a lot of risks. But Phillips got them to do this, and she actually got them to do it by agreeing to make radio and TV versions of The Guiding Light simultaneously, so that they could keep their radio audience and hopefully start to attract people to television as well. Now, she did this for 4 years, did the 2 versions of the show, which is just amazing to think about. And of course, it was live at the time. So Phillips, was really an innovator in these ways. She also pioneered the first 30-minute, one of the first 30-minute long soaps for TV. I should explain that the radio serials and the first ones on TV were only 15 minutes a day. And so going to a 30-minute time slot was quite a big deal. So she created the program As the World Turns in 1956. And that was one of the first 30-minute programs. And As the World Turns and The Guiding Light lasted for decades into the 2000s. Both of them. And so they're very, significant foundational programs to this form. Now, let me talk a bit about soap operas and women's roles in the 1950s. So Verna Phillips, of course, was a career woman, and she even became a single mother to 2 adopted children. She has a fascinating life story. But her work was really focused on validating and celebrating pretty conventional roles for women and family life. She made kind of loving mothers and housewives the center of her programs. Of course, soap operas are really dependent on conflict, like any narrative, like any story. And so even though she put marriage and family at the center of her programs, she really had to cause trouble there, right? Because there wouldn't be a story otherwise. And so these marriages, these families, even in the 1950s, faced lots and lots of problems and troubles. The characters were pretty frequently unhappy. So she really wanted to uphold some pretty traditional values around marriage and family life. And she also wanted to, champion the experiences of women characters. So one of the ways she did this, I have an example to illustrate this for you from the show As the World Turns. It would be great to have more clips to show, but a lot of this didn't survive 56, with a really interesting story of marital infidelity. So the man you see on the left side of your screen in a kind of embrace with a woman, that was Jim Lowell. And Jim Lowell was a married man. His wife, Claire, is in the photo on the other side of the screen. And Jim has an affair with a woman named Edith Hughes. That's the woman he's in the clinch with. Interestingly, in this story, Phillips didn't make it so that any one person was really the villain here. Edith suffers from being involved in this affair. And Phillips really wanted Jim and Claire to get a divorce. She wanted to explore kind of what that would mean for all these different people involved. But Procter & Gamble didn't like that idea. They didn't want to be seen as promoting divorce on their program. And they didn't want Jim to be able to marry Edith and live happily ever after with her. They wanted to, Phillips came up with a great way of dealing with this. The characters, Jim and Claire, are going to get divorced, and then Jim is killed in an accident. And so Phillips found a way that she could, didn't have to make her characters just be permanently miserable from getting divorced. And she could focus on telling the stories of the characters she really was most interested in, who were the women: Claire, the wife who was left behind, and Edith, the mistress. Claire's story became really prominent after this. She has a mental breakdown. She suffers greatly. She comes to some better peace over time. And so Phillips, she never placed blame on traditional gender roles or expectations for women, but she did see her characters as really struggling in those roles and trying to find their kind of true selves in the process. she was really invested in some ideas of that era of the 50s and in therapeutic benefits and finding, better mental health in our language today. She wouldn't have called it that then. She was pretty obsessed with health in general and her own mental health and physical health. All right, let me talk to you a little bit more here. Now, I want to transition and talk to you a little bit about the 1960s now. In the 1960s, the soaps began to shift their focus away from this kind of conventional marriage and family life and gradually began to take on more issues of the day. Across the later 1960s and the 1970s in particular, the soaps began to tell stories that explored new ways of imagining kind of changing aspects of social identity. It's a time, as you know, of great upheaval in American society, of a lot of social movements, the women's liberation movement, the civil rights movement, the student war protests, all of those things. And Phillips was aware of that. And Phillips was aware of that, but other creators were becoming more and more a part of the storytelling world of soap opera. And they were even more interested in those kinds of stories than Phillips was. And so soap operas in general start to explore some of these changes in areas of gender identities and roles, and to some extent even about racial identity, and started to bring in more non-white characters. Now, the assumption was that the audience was still an audience of housewives. And the assumption by those making and sponsoring the soaps assumed that those housewives were white and middle class. They might have known that there was a wider array of people watching, but that was the audience that they kind of went with as an assumption of what was going on. But again, this is the time where there's a growing women's liberation movement, a civil rights movement, and that is leading a lot of creators to start to try to deal with those questions in their programs. Now, to illustrate a bit for you what this was like, I want to contrast two different soap opera stories from this era. Both of these stories were about abortion, and American television has dealt with abortion at various times in its history, but has also gone for long periods of not talking about it at all. So it's kind of notable that there were these two stories in the time period I'm talking about. And you can see some interesting differences between them and similarities, of course. The two stories aired just about 7 years apart, so actually not that long in time. Both focused on stories about young, middle-class white women, kind of college-aged young women. But the differences between these two stories are so telling about the ways that soap opera was changing in this time, and really some of the ways that American women's experience was changing in this time as well. You really can see in these stories the way that there became a different kind of attention to social issues during this period, and the ways that different writers in different production contexts dealt with those changes. Now, my first example comes from a soap opera called Another World. Another World was a new program on NBC starting in 1964. And it was created by Erna Phillips, who was a very well-established TV soap opera writer by that point. And the program was owned by Procter & Gamble. Not all soap operas are owned by Procter & Gamble, but it was a big part of their business for many decades. Now, these elements suggest that Another World would have been a pretty traditional soap, right? Phillips, Procter & Gamble. But it started to incorporate some aspects of the changing society more so than had a lot of other soaps up to this point. So let me show you an image or two to get a sense of who these characters were. Okay, so the young woman you're seeing here was a character named Pat Matthews. And Pat Matthews was a virginal college student, and she gets with this young man, Tom Baxter, and he's kind of a bit of a playboy. And she falls in love with him in scenes that we don't really see very clearly, a lot of off-screen action. They get together and she becomes pregnant. They're not married, if I haven't made that clear. She hides her pregnancy from her family, and eventually she gets an illegal abortion. This is 1964. She gets an infection and falls ill afterward. She becomes sterile as a result of the infection. She shoots and kills Tom when he makes clear to her that their relationship is over. She blocks it all out. Months go by. It's about 9 months or so after that point, and she finally remembers what happened to her, and she tells her family the truth. In many ways, this story was a real cautionary tale for the times of about the horrors, right, that a young woman would encounter if she had sex outside of marriage. And it was very much in keeping with the way the soaps had told these kinds of stories up, and very much in keeping with really the mainstream of American popular culture at the time. Like, there were Hollywood movies that told similar kinds of stories in this era. So even as Pat's story was pretty conservative, soaps are made up of conversations. They're made up of people talking about problems, having long scenes of dialogue. And because of that, there was a lot of time in this story to really talk about Pat's situation and to kind of weigh all different sides of things. And this gave the story the possibility of being kind of understood in lots of different ways. It gave the possibility of seeing Tom not so much as a but kind of as a really unhappy marriage, and he's very worried about marriage as a result. And he's actually quite caring towards Pat, even though he doesn't want to marry her. I found some really interesting material in my research about the network censors and how they asked for some revisions in the dialogue during this story to make clear that Pat was not just a victim. She was making her own choices. And they wanted to make clear that Pat's abortion and the infection that she gets were, not... The abortion didn't cause her to become sterile. The infection she got became sterile. This was the kind of, parsing of details that they would have been very concerned about at that time. Now, this was surely about protecting the network, making those choices. But a lot of these elements resulted in there being some more ambiguity to Pat's story than you might think in such a story at this time period. And it really left viewers thinking about, what was going on here? Did Pat make bad choices? Was her situation just an impossible one? What made it so impossible? It really encouraged people to think about this kind of situation and what it meant for young women in contemporary American life. Now, my second example comes from the program All My Children. All My Children was a new soap opera on ABC in 1971. It began in 1970, but the story I'm going to talk about happened in 1971. And this was a story about this young woman character, Erica Kane Martin. You probably might recognize this young photo of the actress Susan Lucci, who was on this show throughout its lifespan. Erica's a college student. She's newly married to a medical student named Jeff, and she's well aware that she would make a terrible mother. She's a pretty selfish and vain person, and she knows that. She's married, but finds out that she's pregnant and doesn't want to be pregnant. And so she travels from her home in Pennsylvania to New York City, where, thanks to differences in state laws at this point, 1971, this is true in real life as well as in the soap world, she could have a legal abortion in New York at that time. However, the wait for the procedure is very long and she's impatient, and she ends up instead manipulating her way into getting an abortion in her home state of Pennsylvania. So keep in mind, this is 1971. The Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision was passed in 1973. So there was a lot of variation at the time in the real world about the legality of abortion in different states. Now, the convolutions of Erica's attempts to get the abortion offered a really interesting commentary on women's need for this procedure, to which they had quite restricted access because of these differences in laws in different parts of the country. Erica is incredibly determined, and she actually has very logical reasoning about why she should be able to have this abortion. And it was such a different take on the story that was told on Another World about Pat just 7 years early. It really struck unwavering in her pursuing this abortion. She's certain that she doesn't want to be a mother, that she'd be a bad mother, that she has the right to decide for herself what happens to her. And so she really voices a lot of these attitudes about women's rights to abortion that would have been part of the larger public discussion at that time. Erica falls ill from an infection after the abortion, the common happening on the soaps. And even though that happens to her, she never regrets her actions, and she kind of doesn't do the right things to take care of herself, which is why she gets the infection. And she lies to people about it. She never admits initially that she's had the abortion. And eventually the other characters accept, once they find out the truth and she makes her case to them, they basically accept that this was her decision, including her husband, Jeff, who's angry at her for lying, but understands why she got the abortion. In many ways, Erica's story was a real kind of reimagining of the Pat story on Another World. Really, the story Erica tells the doctor to manipulate her way into getting the abortion is basically Pat's experience. But Erica is nothing like Pat. She is totally in control of the situation. She has no regrets about what she's doing. And Pat totally has no control over what happens to her. Erica doesn't really suffer that much, and Pat suffers for years and has a terrible experience as a result. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about, some of the reasons for these differences. Both stories are quite different from the brief attention to abortion in primetime TV in this period. There were a few medical and legal series at the time that did episodes dealing with abortion, but usually male characters were at the center of those stories, like the doctors or lawyers who were the main characters of the show. And the women who had abortions in those shows, they were usually treated pretty sympathetically, but it really wasn't their story. And the soaps did this very differently, in that they made these women characters the center of the story. Now, how to explain these differences? Part of it is like the changing times, as I was saying. Both are pre-Roe versus Wade. But this was a period over which American public opinion was really changing about abortion. And it starts to shift and become more widely accepted throughout the country that this might be a necessary procedure for some women in some circumstances. And so the two stories are kind of at the beginning of those shifting attitudes and then closer to them peaking in the Roe versus Wade case. But there's some other reasons as well that I think are important to understand. Let me go back to my slides to show you something about this storytelling behind this. So, a woman named Agnes Nixon. Nixon was a protege of Verna Phillips. Phillips taught her how to write for soaps. And Nixon had worked on Another World with Phillips in 1965. She knew about Pat's story, Agnes Nixon did. She was younger and more politically progressive than Phillips. She was Catholic and she had very distinct social justice leanings, and she was pro-choice. Phillips was pretty conservative, was, unmarried and a single adoptive mother, so she had an unconventional life, but she was, from an older generation. Now, at the time of this story on All My Children, Nixon owned her own production company along with her husband, and that is the company that created All My Children. She still had to deal with the network and get their approval for things. But Phillips, had long worked with networks, but also with most of her shows with Procter and Gamble, which had been this company that was, as I was saying earlier, pretty conservative. So Nixon had a lot more creative control than Phillips did when she made her show. ABC was also a younger network. It was newer to daytime soaps, and it was eager to kind of distinguish itself and be more edgy. So all of that might help us to explain some of these differences. Now, there's many more ways that the soap operas of this period, especially into the 1970s, really explored some new aspects of the times. And that, is a story that I could tell you lots of different examples of, but it's a really fascinating period because there was a lot of willingness to experiment with different kinds of stories about different kinds of characters, including even sometimes some non-white characters. The soaps had been overwhelmingly white in their characters for most of their history. But Nixon, Agnes Nixon, on another of her shows, One Life to Live, did this really fascinating story in the late 60s about a Black woman who was passing as white. And I don't have time to explain all the details of that story today, but it really examined what it meant to be a woman and a woman of color in a particular time period and living within certain pressures in a way that we have seen very little of in American culture as a whole. Nonetheless, in this, daytime form, it was really an amazing moment in the history of these programs. Now, I'd like to turn now and talk a little bit about what happens with the soaps in the 1980s and what started to change in that time period, especially in terms of gender roles. In the early 1980s, a number of soap operas started to try out new kinds of stories, largely in response to the popularity of one particular soap opera, General Hospital. General Hospital kind of built on those trends from the 70s by focusing on younger characters. In particular, one younger couple that you may have heard of, Luke and Laura, and they became hugely popular. These kinds of characters, these young couples who would have these great adventures, like Luke and Laura, became known as super couples eventually. And the super couples would go on location shoots and they would go out on the run and have all kinds of adventures together. I've got a picture here of a whole bunch of the different super couples. So you can just like get a sense of that 80s glory of what these folks all looked like. And these stories really appealed to audiences in general and young audiences in particular. The soap audience had been getting younger throughout the 70s, and these shows, these storylines with these super couples really attracted that audience into the 80s as well. These stories were fun to watch. They combined the typical soap attention to interpersonal relationships and conversation with new things like comedy and action adventure and mystery and science fiction, pop music, lots of romance, and increasingly more explicit kinds of love scenes. As I said, they often included location shooting, which was very unusual for the soaps up until that point. It started in the 70s, but really became a big deal in the 80s. And this was, a kind of huge popular sensation really at the time. And, if you watched soaps, you likely did watch in that era because they were so popular at that time. These storylines really helped to make soap operas kind of mass popular sensations. A wide array of people watched soaps. Soap stars appeared on the cover of mainstream magazines. They were kind of a common pop culture currency in this period, particularly the early 1980s. And they made a lot of money at that time, as advertisers really wanted to put their products on during these programs because it was a way to, attract lots of potential customers. Now, I want to say a little bit about kind of the ways that this kind of almost fantasy period in soap opera history really kind of walked an interesting and fine line when it came to gender roles. In many ways, this period kind of combined some of the real, progressive elements that the women's movement had introduced, that feminist activism had led to greater equality between men and women. But at the same time, these stories also kind of showed some of the more conservative forces that were having more and more power in American society during this time that wanted to kind of return to some of those more conventional gender roles. Now, the soaps kind of walk this line between these different ways of thinking about identity in a few ways. One way is that they kind of stopped talking about those social issues that had been such a big part of the shows in the late 60s and the 70s. They kind of went totally into fantasy land and left a lot of that behind. There's a few exceptions to this, but on the whole, that was the trend. The characters and the stories really did reflect a world that had been changed by the feminist movement. The super couples and their adventures, they fulfilled conventional gender roles in various ways, but they were also depicted as equals. They depended on each other. They kind of shared in their adventures. They were both often really dissatisfied with their kind of regular conventional lives and wanted to go and have these big adventures instead. The women would be really bold and self-assured, and the men were kind of rebels with tender hearts, and they weren't like a traditional, male provider types. So there are these kind of interesting ways in which these couples were constructed. At the same time, however, these relationships told audiences that gender inequalities and other kinds of social inequalities were in the past, that they didn't need to worry about them anymore. Often these couples came from different kind of class status backgrounds. Often the woman was more kind of from a privileged, wealthy background, and the man was from a more, humble kind of origins. And the 80s, of course, were a time when economic inequality was really growing in American society. And the super couples kind of offered this sort of fantasy, like, victory over that, in that they could always defeat their differences in background. It didn't matter that one came from money and one didn't. It was one way that the soaps kind of made it seem as if those sorts of problems just didn't exist and weren't part of the world at that time. The super couples were almost all exclusively white. They were all young. They were all heterosexual. They offered a fantasy of a world where kind of all kinds of inequalities just were no longer a problem. Gender inequality, class inequality, racial inequality. And the kind of implicit message was that the fantasy was only available to these kinds of people, right? So it was a fantasy, but it was a really limited fantasy in terms of who could access it. So in these ways, these fantasy super couple stories, they benefited a lot from the feminist movement, and they offered this kind of idealized vision of these heterosexual couples who could be real equal partners. But it was also a time that could really be understood as reinforcing pretty conventional aspects of identity, kind of refusing to pay attention to some of the inequalities that continued in the society. Is really an interesting moment. And I think part of what was so compelling to so many people about these stories was that those were conflicts and contradictions that people were experiencing and feeling in their real lives. And the soaps gave them this kind of fantasy space to think about those things and to imagine how they might be affecting those characters' lives, but also reflect on their own experience. Now, in my book, I make the point that some of the limitations on these fantasies that the soaps offered in terms of who could have access to them at the heart of what would become a problem for soaps in the years to come, in terms of losing some of their popularity and their audience. That said, probably the most significant thing for what happens to the soaps after this really big period of popularity in the 80s is the changes that happen to television itself. This is the time when cable comes along, and then, of course, the internet is soon to follow. And that really changes the environment in which daytime soap operas. And all of these forces together really help us to understand kind of some of the things that change about the soap's cultural prominence after this period of the 80s. They're still here, of course, but they do kind of go away in some ways. They don't have the status they once did. At one time in the 70s, there were 19 soaps on the air. And today there's 4. So I hope this picture that I've been painting for you of the history of the US daytime soap opera kind of helps you to see kind of some new dimensions to this form of television programming and its significance for thinking about how our culture has imagined gender identity and women's roles in particular, especially I think in these decades where these programs were so heavily watched from their beginnings in the 50s through definitely through the 80s. They continue to play this part today, but they're just not, it's not as central to our cultural conversation because we have so much more TV, so many different more options available to us now. I think we can learn quite a lot about the role of television in American culture and the ways that we imagine, our identities, who we are, who other people are, by examining these kinds of stories, the stories that we tell, and thinking about who stories are directed to, who's telling the stories, and what kinds of stories we get as a result, and how we can use them to make sense of our world and our own lives. So thank you. I hope that wasn't too much and too quick of an overview I'm going to bring David back on, and I think we'll be able to take some questions and have more of a conversation from here on out. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So much to think about and so much great detail. I have a few questions for you, and then I encourage our audience to type your questions in as well, and we'll take some of those. So my first question for you is, how did your wonderful book come about? And was there a particular moment where you said, yes, I need to write this? And what was that?
It's such a good question. So I always, from the time I started graduate school, I always wanted to write about soap operas, but I wasn't quite sure how to do it because it's a lot. It's such a big topic, and because others had written about them in certain respects. In my first book, which is Wallowing in Sex, which is about American TV in the 70s, I wrote a chapter in that book about rape stories on soaps in the 70s. And I just was fascinated by the things I found in that chapter. And it made me think maybe it is really possible to write a history of this form, even though there's so much that's hard to access and all of that. But I was like, I could do it for this chapter. Maybe I could do it for a whole book. And so I just started to do more exploring. And I think actually, in the late 2000s, when a number of soaps started getting canceled, when we had that era where Guiding Light and As the World Turns, and then All My Children and One Life to Live got canceled, it really started to make me feel like, I think this is the time. I need to write this book now because something is changing, right? Like, I'm thrilled that there's still 4 shows on the air, but that, it was such a shift. It was like half the shows were gone pretty quickly after all of TV history of them being so prominent. And so I think that was what really pushed me. It was the combination of like having started to feel earlier that decade that it would actually be possible to do this research, and then having that big shift happen where something was clearly changing about the role of soap opera in American TV and American culture. That those two things together really combined for me. I think it made me think, okay, I think this is the time to work on this. Also, I have to say the internet, like having access to the internet, it made doing certain kinds of research so much more possible. I mean, I did lots of other research in archives and libraries and things like that, but there's so many amazing soap viewers and fans on the internet who can explain stories about what happened when I was trying to piece together things. And I couldn't have written it if I didn't have access to that, and couldn't find people who could explain things to me when I was trying to understand something that had happened.
Some of those lovers of the genre are with us today, and they're writing some wonderful comments in. I have another question. You mentioned doing, a lot of research and so on, and obviously this took an immense amount of research. Was there one piece of research that surprised you above all other, where you said, I had no idea about that?
Gosh, I think there were probably multiple. I mean, one was, Erica's abortion story that I was talking about earlier. Anytime I'd heard about it, everyone talked about it happening after Roe versus Wade. And the tapes of this story don't exist as far as I know. I've been able to find anywhere, but the scripts do. And when I went and read the scripts, I found out that it happened in 1971. And I was shocked. And still, if you go look on the internet, most places it will say it was in 73. And it was not. It was in 1971, which seemed all the more remarkable to me that it happened before Roe versus Wade. So that was definitely one of the things that really kind of surprised me. I think just the stories about how Erna Phillips got Guiding Light moved to television and got kind of TV soaps started in general were also really eye-opening, and just how much was her pushing for it and how much big of a difference that made.
We have a question from Elizabeth, who asks, how do you think the older super couples of the 80s, like One Life to Live's Vicky and Clint, or As the World Turns, Lucinda and John, fit into the fantasy narrative that was so overwhelmingly youth-oriented?
That's a great question. There definitely were those couples that were not the, super young couples. I think that they didn't tend to go on the same kinds of wild adventures, although they did have some of the elements of comedy and other kinds of adventure in their storylines. I think that, some of those couples had been around for a while, or the characters had at least. And I think that the shows learned a lot from the youth stories about what was fun and appealing to audiences. And then they expanded and told those stories about different characters as well. I mean, the Stokes had always told stories about people of lots of different ages. So actually what was unusual was that they were so youth focused at the time, because that was not the pattern for most of the history of soaps.
We have another question. How did women entering the workforce influence the soaps?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one of the things that really pushed the youth turn. It was because there was a worry that women would be, working during the day and not home to watch. But fortunately, probably for the soaps, the women becoming more and more part of the workforce happened kind of at the same time as new technologies like the VCR came around. And the VCR was incredibly important for soap opera. Many people continued to watch their shows by recording them and as they were in the workplace or couldn't be there to watch, that kind of thing. And so I think that that's a story that we don't quite know all the details of, because I don't know that the industry was ever really able to document who was videotaping and watching later. But I think that a lot of women continued to watch even when they went into the workplace. But soaps always featured stories about working women. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, there were, women doctors on soaps and things like that. And so, maybe we can see the soaps as a place that inspired some women to start pursuing careers as well.
Jules asks about if you have any information on when men started watching soaps.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's definitely a lot of evidence that in the 70s, men started to watch in greater numbers and then carrying on from there. This is in part was just part of the expansion of the audience of younger people watching, multi-generational families watching together. But I also think men have probably always watched and have not been, because so much of the soaps was about being able to advertise certain kinds of, home products to women, that the networks didn't really care that there were men there, or they didn't pay attention to it. It didn't kind of matter for their business model. And so I mean, given how many stories I hear about men watching and then some of the, actual evidence I found of that, I think that there's been many more men in the soap audience than has been acknowledged or recognized throughout much of its history. But there's definitely lots of examples in the 70s and 80s of, men writing letters to soap opera fan magazines, or, being interviewed in news stories and things like that. So there was definitely a growing male audience that was visible, at least by that point.
Elena, we have another question, interesting question from John. He asks if The Edge of Night was conceived as a daytime version of Perry Mason.
Gosh, I'm not 100% sure about that. I believe that is something that I've heard, and I would need to go back and look at some sources to remind myself for sure. The Edge of Night was a really interesting show. Like As the World Turns, it was one of the first 30-minute soaps starting in 1956. And it was much more of a mystery show, like a legal and mystery show, than was typical of the soaps at the time, which tended to be more just kind of family dramas. And so over its history, it's shifted and became, I think, a little more of a conventional soap. But it definitely has some of that vibe. And I know that other shows, like when General Hospital started in 1963, it was really envisioned as like a daytime version of Marcus Welby, or, one of the primetime medical shows that was becoming really successful. So that point about Perry Mason does sound familiar to me. I think it's likely that was what people had in mind. I don't know that it was, literally seen as a version of it. I'd have to do some digging to find that out.
Got it. Great questions. The great questions continue. Steve asks, do you have any insights about the LGBTQ community's longstanding affinity for the soaps?
Well, like male audiences in general, I think that the LGBTQ audience has always been there. And I think that this coincides also with just growing visibility of LGBTQ identities that doesn't start to happen in American culture until the 70s as well. So the 70s is a really important period. We think a lot about the 80s, I think, about in terms of American soaps, but I think a lot of almost everything that happens in the 80s started in the 70s. And that includes broader audiences being interested and being increasingly visible. Soaps did do some attempts at gay and lesbian stories in the 70s, but it's pretty tentative, and it doesn't really take off until like the late 90s, early 2000s in soaps. It's one of the, the soaps are kind of have been ahead of the game in some ways in the kinds of stories they tell and really behind in others. And I think that is one way that they were more behind. And I think it's because a lot of folks in the industry really thought our audience is straight women and they don't want to see stories about other kinds of, of other kinds of experience. And that was probably not true again, but I think so much of it was that because the model was built around this idea that this was like a genre for housewives, that assumption guided a lot of the thinking about the storytelling. But as with men in general, I think other kinds of audiences were there for, perhaps all the time. And there's, as probably some of there's like a huge fan culture and especially historical fan community on the internet now, many of whom are gay men who know a ton about soap opera history. And so I don't know if they were watching all along or they've just become aficionados and have learned about the past, but there's definitely this world of investment there that we probably just don't know enough about.
So many great questions coming in. I have one more before I go to some of the ones from our great audience. A lot of people will say that the soap opera, even though there are only 4 daytime shows left, that it's still with us in other forms, and that it's morphed into things like the Real Housewives franchise. What is your feeling on that? Do you agree? Do you disagree?
I do agree. That's usually Andy Cohen who says that about the Housewives. So he's patting himself on the back, I think, on that one. Frankly, I would make the case that almost everything about contemporary TV storytelling is influenced by the soaps. That there's so much more continuing storytelling, serialized narrative in television now than there ever was in the past. And soap opera was where that happened, was where that was done first, was where that storytelling mode was developed for television. So I think there's a lot of influence there. I agree that reality TV is drawing on some of those same pleasures. I think some of the pleasures that people find in social media and kind of following characters, people they know or don't know, and watching their lives unfold is very similar to some of the pleasures of soap opera. Of course, in daytime soap opera, there's these, expert hands sort of guiding you through the story. And so personally, I find that more satisfying than some of these other forms that don't have the same kinds of payoffs. But there's definitely a huge influence. I mean, I think a big case that I'm trying to make in the book is that soaps were really foundational for all of American television. Economically, certainly, they really, boosted the economics of the industry for decades, and also in terms of storytelling, in that they kind of helped to innovate and develop ways of telling stories about continuing characters that have been carried over into all of TV.
Lisa asks, do you think any or all of the 4 remaining soaps will disappear from daytime television, or do you see a potential resurgence of the daytime soaps, especially on streaming platforms?
Yeah, that is the question. In 2012, I was really scared that they were going to be not long for, continuing. And, almost 10 years later, the 4 shows that were on in 2012 are still here. And so I do take some comfort in that thinking okay, these shows have all found ways to survive. often it's by having pretty drastic budget cuts, which is unfortunate. But there's been ways that they've been made to work even with that being the case. I kind of don't know why a streamer hasn't tried a soap yet, or hasn't picked up old episodes of a current or former soap and put them on. Like, I hear a lot of talk about this around Passions, which, wasn't on for so long, like wasn't on for that long compared to some soaps, and was on more recently enough that those episodes all exist, that they seem perfect for like just loading onto Peacock. Hasn't happened yet. And of course, there's a million, economic reasons why these things don't happen just like that. But I think it could happen. And there's always another rumor. There's always another story. I'm not sure that there's going to be any more in the daytime form that we're used to. But again, after what happened, As the World Turns and Guiding Light were canceled, and then I think and many people were shocked when All My Children and One Life to Live were canceled. And I think that after that, I said, I'm not making predictions. I don't know what's going to happen. Anything can happen. Something I talk a bit about in the book is that some shows, especially The Bold and Beautiful, but also Young and the Restless, have done great at international sales and international distribution, which I think has been a big help towards sustaining them as the broadcast ratings have declined and all of that. But yeah, I think I'm not sure that the form as we know it in daytime broadcasting is going to grow, and I hope the shows that exist now will continue. But I do think there's some possibilities in some of these new delivery formats.
So I have a question. I'm dying to know. You've mentioned a lot of these wonderful classic characters and classic storylines and soaps that we miss and we currently love. I'm curious if you have a favorite soap, a favorite character, and a favorite storyline.
Oh my gosh, I should have thought about adding this question. So I started watching General Hospital in 1981. I was a kid. I got swept up in the Luke and Laura fever and have watched it religiously since. I'm sort of just like a completist. I have to watch all once I'm committed. So even though, as most soap viewers would probably tell you, like a lot of the time they're not that happy with their show. I can't not say that that's my favorite because I've watched it for so long. And that's the only show I've watched consistently, like every day for decades. But that said, when I doing the book and some other just kind of explorations over the years, I kind of became really fond of some other years or so of Ryan's Hope, which was available on SoapNet for a while. And I love it. I love Ryan's Hope. So, there's these others characters. Oh gosh, I don't know if I can pick a favorite. I do love those 80s, those 80s characters from the soaps. I came in late in the Luke and Laura thing, so I'm not like a serious Luke and Laura fan. I loved Frisco and Felicia. I love Robert, Scorpio, and Anna. Those kinds of characters are probably the ones that are still like closest to my heart.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you, and I want to thank our fabulous audience today for joining us. Elana, thank you so much, and congratulations on your fantastic book. To pick up a copy, you can do so through the link in the chat feature. I also want to just say that if you would like more information on the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm David Zyla. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.